in session. We are adjourned from executive session. No action will be taken. Will the clerk please take the roll?
Councilmember Smith?
Here.
Councilmember Marshall?
Present.
Mayor Baker?
Here.
Councilmember Curtis?
Present.
Councilmember Shrubnik?
Here.
Councilmember Danuski?
Here.
Deputy Mayor Herbig?
Here.
If you will please stand and join me in the pledge of allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Today we remember, we'll never forget, the nearly 3,000 lives taken from us on September 11th. We honor the courage of those who put themselves in harm's way to save people they never knew. 17 years may seem like a long time, but for the families who lost a piece of their heart that day, I imagine it can seem like today, Americans join together to honor the memory. In 2001, September 11th was designated as Patriot Day. In 2001, the Congress designated September 11th. To honor the memory of this day tonight, I'm going to all observe a moment of silence in tribute to those lives cut short. Places left behind in the hearts of those still living. I also ask us to remember the danger and uncertainty, countless civilians and first responders who risked their lives. Let us reaffirm the value they stood for and let us move forward as one nation. Please. Next item on the agenda is approval of the agenda. If there are no objections to stand, the agenda will stand approved as written. And just tonight is a special meeting. That's why there's no comments or that. And this is one subject and one subject only. And so the first item and the only item on the agenda is a study session on Lakepointe, followed by a one-item business agenda. So, Lakepointe update.
We're going to start off with Rob Karlinsey.
Yeah, if that's okay, Your Honor.
Yes, please.
Yeah, so on August 13th, we talked about Lakepointe. And this topic is such a big deal to our community that we thought it'd be worth coming back and talking about it again tonight. And in particular, the financial pro forma that was recently conducted by HR&A. We wanted to give you a good month to digest their report and think about it and ponder it and come tonight with any other questions or comments you have on that report. So last month and last summer, we, in partnership with the developer, we accomplished a really important milestone. The completion of that financial pro forma report that analyzes the financial feasibility of the Lakepointe project and its funding gap due to the site's extraordinary costs. Knowing the gap, we can work with the developer to narrow the gap through tools available to the city, while assuring that the project produces public benefits and amenities. Lakepointe is the last undeveloped site of its kind on Lake Washington and has the potential to transform our downtown, provide new housing, office, and retail service options for our community, and produce unprecedented new public open space, waterfront access, and other recreational opportunities. Lakepointe can be a true waterfront village right in the heart of our city. As I said, however, getting there is far from easy. How to mitigate traffic and other impacts and how to close the gap caused by the extraordinary costs will be the major obstacles. But I believe we are further along than we were 2 years ago, especially with the completion of this financial pro forma report. And I believe that our man on the moon goal that we set back in 2013 is still achievable, and that is to see Lakepointe break ground by the year 2023. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Bryan Hampson to talk a little bit about process.
Yeah, as Rob mentioned, well, first off, good evening, Council, and thanks for having us back to discuss this again. As Rob mentioned, we brought this to the public and for Council's eyes August 13th of 2018. And being such a large amount of information, we really needed to give you a little bit more time to digest it. And so we are coming back now after some considerable time to digest it. And hopefully the goal today is to answer your questions, if you have any questions that you've come up with over the last month, and also accept the pro forma and ultimately give us direction to go forward and draft a parameter agreement with the developer, Mr. Weidner. And so we brought back HR&A today that we're here on August 13th to go over their financial feasibility study again and hopefully answer any other questions that you may have, and I'll introduce them in a minute. And also we have the developer with us again, Mr. Weidner, and he's going to give another brief overview of his vision of the project. And somebody new with us today is Bryan O'Connor. He's a local consultant that we use to help verify some of the figures and that we were seeing in the analysis. And so with that, I'll turn it over to I'm going to introduce HR&A. We have Candace Damon from HR&A, Olivia Moss, and from the Weidner Company, we have Mr. Weidner and Kieran Hines. And I introduced Bryan, and so with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Mr. Weidner for his presentation.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here for the council. This presentation is really about the potential of Lakepointe, a vibrant, well-planned expansion of Kenmore's downtown. Lakepointe will showcase the most prominent feature of Kenmore, its waterfront. This 52-acre peninsula is actually the front door for the city of Kenmore. Imagine 3/4 of a mile of stunning, beautiful shoreline, plus an island featuring a birder's paradise. Now, talk about accessible. This property is bounded by the Burke-Gilman Trail, where a biker can access Bothell in 10 minutes, Woodinville in 18 minutes, the University of Washington main campus in 20 minutes, and Redmond in 30 minutes. If you are traveling by car or transit, just look at the east-west access to Seattle or Kirkland Bellevue via State Route 522. At the same time, to the north and south, 68th Avenue provides access to the rest of Kenmore and beyond. Now, please notice the blue highlighted area. That's Lakepointe, which increases the size of Kenmore's downtown by approximately 35%. However, the best part of the entire project is its water access for the public to walk, jog, bike, swim, canoe, kayak, or simply enjoy the waterfront ambiance that satisfies your soul. This view of Lakepointe is its west end. To the right is the Sammamish River, and extreme right is Squaw Island. This slide shows the north side of Lakepointe, its protected waters, which we like to refer to as its inner harbor. This area, with views toward downtown Kenmore, will be perfect for restaurants and boutique shops with easy access to strolling along these peaceful waters. This slide shows Lakepointe's southern shore along the Sammamish River. You can see a small motorboat and then a kayak moving towards Lake Washington. Squaw Island is on its left and has a heron rookery. Now, we view the magic of Lakepointe to be its potential for public shoreline and open space. The public shoreline is shown and highlighted by this green area around the southern end and a little bit on the western end. It looks blue-green here on the screen. 4 proposed public parks with access to the water are highlighted in orange. And Lakepointe's Inner Harbor Wharf area is shown at the top of the slide here in red. Now, we further describe these shoreline and open space areas as a natural edge or waterfront parks and promenade, a waterfront amphitheater on the west end, or the Inner Harbor Wharf. Here are some examples of how these areas could be translated into reality. First, a slightly elevated boardwalk built to protect sensitive wetland and habitat areas. In this slide, we envision a kayak and canoe shop, storage area, and lakeside boat launch. This slide illustrates a vision of a waterfront park and promenade that can safely accommodate bikers, walkers, and joggers. Since we have 4 planned parks, this is another version of a park area and promenade. And this promenade, just by itself, will be wide enough to accommodate emergency fire and life safety vehicles if needed. This slide illustrates one possible look for our waterfront amphitheater. This amphitheater is planned at the northwest corner of Lakepointe. Now for our inner harbor. This is the area in which we invite the public to stroll beside the water while incorporating visits to our boutique shops or restaurants. This view of our Inner Harbor Wharf shows the degree of accessibility we envision to our restaurant and shopping area. This is the type of outdoor activity that we think it will generate. Now, in total, we are planning almost 15 acres of public shoreline and parks, promenades, an amphitheater, and an inner harbor area. 15 acres of open space and water access. Now, to make this dream come true, we must create a vibrant, people-centered community with residences, jobs, services, and entertainment. We plan to populate it with townhomes, apartments, condos, retail, offices, and a hotel. After all, this 50-acre site will expand Kenmore's current downtown area by 35%. And this is what it would look like. We continue to envision a hotel, as seen in this picture, as well as an interpretive center, which is partially shown on the right. This is another rendition of a waterfront amphitheater with hotel, restaurants, townhomes, and condos in the background. This slide illustrates our 2-story townhomes backed by condos and further back by an apartment building. It also features a boathouse, floating dock, and competitive rowing at the right.
Quick question. How many stories are those condos that you're showing in that slide?
Those 5 to 6 stories.
Okay.
Here we are back at the hotel where we witness wide walkable sidewalks as well as an entrance to one of the apartment buildings on the left. This slide shows our Inner Harbor Wharf area with the waterfront, restaurants, shops, and hotel in the background. And finally, this slide reveals an apartment community located along the southeast side of Lakepointe. Now, Lakepointe is truly a transformational project. It plans to turn a dusty, underutilized industrial manufacturing site into a vibrant 18-hour high-end community that provides housing, jobs, recreation, and public access to 3/4 of a mile of waterfront, all in the heart of downtown Kenmore. And at the same time, Lakepointe, when completed, will considerably strengthen Kenmore's finances through the huge generation of sales, use, and real estate taxes that it will generate. In fact, it will expand Kenmore's total tax revenues by well over 35%. And what we're looking to do next is to provide a framework for the development agreement and public-private partnership. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dane. Before we turn it over to HR&A to go through their presentation, do you guys have any questions for Mr. Weidner or see anything on the diagrams that he showed that you'd like further information on?
Councilmember Danuski.
Hi, in your current vision, how high do you expect your buildings to be?
I think the highest that we envisioned at this point would be 7 to 8 stories.
Thank you.
On the visual that you presented that had the perimeter shown in blue, most of it, and then there was the pink Inner Harbor,
Yes.
What parts of those are public, or is that all public access?
That would all be public access, and we would actually create a tie-in to the Burke-Gilman Trail so that anyone using that trail could go around the perimeter of this development.
Right. Thank you.
Councilmember Smith.
Yes, on the breakdown on the open space, it was about 15 acres. Does that include all the requirements that would be under the underlying P suffix zoning requirements, or is that just a combination of what you're adding plus what the zoning would already require and the approved CSDP?
No, that does include the requirements
Okay.
that are currently
Do you know
there.
what that percentage is of that 15 acres approximately, just ballpark? Of what is required of that versus what?
That I don't know.
Okay, that's okay. Thank you.
City Manager.
We, guys, speak to that real quick, Rob. We are planning on putting a matrix together that will show what elements of the P suffix or the code are being met or possibly deviated from. And so maybe the next time we come back to council, we can have that matrix. And it'll show the amount of open space that's required and how much open space the developer is proposing.
Mind going back 2 slides? Go back 2 slides.
Sure.
Yeah, so that tall building there, I was trying to count the number of stories, but you're saying the highest building you'd see would be 7 or 8?
Yes, highest building would be 7 or 8.
That one kind of looks like it's more than that, but I just,
Obviously, this is an artist rendition. I think
Yeah.
if I counted it correctly right now, it says 9, but that's not what we're considering. We'd be considering 7 or 8 max.
7 or 8, okay, thank you.
You have, no,
Yeah, on parking, can you say a little bit about your parking assumptions, both for residential and retail commercial? Per unit ratios, things like that.
Boy, that's a good question. For the residential, we'd be envisioning parking for each type of structure between 1 to 1.5 per bedroom.
Got it.
And I believe that actually works within the current code. For the retail, I don't recall that off the top of my head, but it would be the normal allocation for retail.
Thanks.
You want to spread
We just have to shift the computer down so Olivia can use it.
on the straight places?
I think I can just use this if that's okay.
Sure.
Just do it from my seat. It's fine. Or I can do it, yeah. Thank you. Thank you for having us back this month. We're glad to be back to go through some of our findings again and answer any questions that you have about our analysis as the project moves forward. As a reminder, HR&A is a real estate and economic development advisory firm, and while we have offices in New York, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., Dallas, and Raleigh, we work on projects at the intersection of public and private real estate development and economic development across the country, including regionally in the Central Waterfront in Seattle, for projects on the east side for Sound Transit, and throughout Oregon, including Willamette Falls. For large-scale development projects and economic development projects across the country, our firm is often called on to verify or test the market demand and market rationale for a project and program, particularly for projects that are sort of on the leading edge or cutting edge of the market, like Lakepointe would be, and also to provide advisory services around how the public and private sectors can work together to move complex projects, complex but transformational projects like this one forward. As City Manager Karlinsey mentioned, we started with the City and Weidner teams earlier this year with a kickoff and gaining understanding of the project, Kenmore, and their surrounding market. We conducted our own market scan and worked closely with Bryan O'Connor to understand sort of what was changing in and around Kenmore today. And we then moved over the course of the summer to the feasibility analysis and an economic and fiscal impact analysis, the results of which I'll go over again tonight. And we are now here again, as we were in August, to talk about next steps for this exciting project. Our overall project objectives were to test the feasibility of alternative development programs for Lakepointe, including the currently permitted, the developer proposed, and an alternative that was created through our study, to estimate the economic and fiscal impacts of each of these development programs, and identify options for public-private partnerships to advance the project toward implementation. And the key findings of our study were really essentially that a public-private partnership will be necessary to ensure the successful advancement of the transformative project that could be Lakepointe. Based on our understanding of the market, a future for Lakepointe that offers the best of urban and suburban living is easy to imagine, and the data suggests, based on demand in the area and where Kenmore is in development today, it is highly plausible. But regardless of who is developing that transformational project, a public-private partnership will be required to support the site's development given the extensive infrastructure and remediation needs to make vertical development a reality. And if that public-private partnership is successful, the project could create sizable economic and fiscal benefits to the city of Kenmore and surrounding districts. But given the significant size of the feasibility gap we found and the need for public-private partnership, we believe that there is a need for a commitment to the city and the Weidner team to continue working forward toward an agreement, understanding sort of the many tools that might be available to mitigate or narrow that gap, and toward project implementation, and that process needs to include a forthright discussion of the financial and social objectives of the project, as well as exploration of the multiple tools that might be available, and part of that discussion hopefully will be starting tonight.
Before we move, can I have a comment on that slide? As Olivia mentioned, the economic and fiscal impact that the HR&A studied, this was an analysis that was done for the city, and this was to see what the actual cost would occur at one time or ongoing costs over a long period. And so this is actually a sort of a different type of study than it was done on the actual project itself for the Weidner and the market and financial feasibility portion of it. This is a study that we would typically do if we were going to annex some area within our city to see what kind of needs would be to keep that area going and pay for it, or whatever costs that are going to occur to the city.
So delving into some of our findings, in recent years, the market in and around Kenmore has experienced significant growth and a shift in housing preferences driving demand. In total, the study area we examined, which extends north and south of Kenmore, has seen a population growth in 22%, leading King County's population and higher rates than we've seen in the county and the state overall. This includes an increase of 37% of renter-occupied households, a 7% increase in median household income across the district, and is predominantly driven by a significant share of growth in adults ages 25 to 44, and only an 8% increase in family households. So really shifting the preference for both renter households, and we've also seen for larger scale buildings, multifamily buildings. Based on the findings of our study, we understand that Lakepointe has significant potential to capture the large pipeline of demand that is coming throughout the region and potentially to Kenmore. We recommended maximizing multifamily rental density on the site, consistent with those underlying demographic shifts that we were talking about. Consider potential to attract a large anchor tenant, capturing a portion of the approximately 4 million square feet of office space that we think could be captured outside of traditional CBDs based on a 10-year projection of office demand, given the increasing rent in central business districts and low vacancy in surrounding submarkets, which are already established office districts. We see the role of retail as positioning retail to amenitize the overall program, but also establishing Lakepointe as a destination for retail activity. As Dean mentioned, a place where people can visit shops, enjoy restaurants, and enjoy the waterfront. And we think that there's a need to approach a hotel program with caution, that there may be an opportunity to work with an operator or highly specialized brand partner for a hotel on site, but that there is a significant pipeline of hotel product coming online in response to the significant recent growth in tourist demand. Based on this analysis, we tested what is in the last row of this table here, which we called the HR&A alternative, which is a slight differentiation from the developer proposed program in that we concentrated residential units in multifamily buildings, slightly cutting down the number of residential units across the site, reduced the amount of office based on the capture rate the site might command from what we see as office demand outside of the CBDs, and then maintained the amount of retail space and have tested a program without hotel. You'll also note that we have a slightly lower number of parking spaces based on a slightly reduced parking ratio across uses in the HR&A alternative. We then tested this program against the currently permitted CSDP and the developer proposed program at the time that we started our study, which are all shown here.
If I may, Olivia, because sometimes this gets a little bit academic and consultants talking consulting-ese. It is the job of a consulting firm like ours, I think, to be conservative. And what we've described and what we analyzed is a program that we believe is conservative and works in the current market. What the Weidner team has described is what a developer should be proposing, is something that's aspirational and focused on the long term. What actually gets built is, of course, a function of how the market develops over the number of years that it's going to take to build out this program. And my guess is it looks somewhere in between the HR&A and the developer proposed program, probably more like the developer proposed program, but we'll have to wait and see. But as you'll see, it's a fairly narrow range that's quite different from what was described, 20 years ago in the earlier program that describes a Kenmore that no longer exists.
And so we'll move into the financial feasibility findings, first addressing cost. The premise of one of our major findings, an overarching finding, is that due to the high remediation and site infrastructure requirements on this site, any development will require public-private partnership, which is driven largely by the cost shown on this slide. The CSDP has a total horizontal cost of approximately $370 million, driven largely by a fairly burdensome strategy around transportation improvements that required essentially a platform and system for parking and access across the site that introduced a very high site cost. The Weidner team has taken a different strategy for access into and throughout the site, resulting in approximately $226 million, comparable to the HR&A alternative at just about $230 million, with just a small variation in site stabilization and remediation costs based on those programs tested. And this significant horizontal cost is driving what we refer to as the financial feasibility gap. So in all cases, the project overall results in a negative net present value, but the financial feasibility gap between the CSDP and developer proposed HR&A alternatives reveals a key difference. Within the CSDP, the financial feasibility gap is so large that it could not be calculated in our model, meaning that the developer could not achieve the return that we were testing against, the 16 to 20% IRR, which was sort of a standard range of return based on our market scan. For the developer proposed program, we found a gap of approximately $134 million to $165 million, and for the HR&A alternative, overlapping and slightly lower at $130 million to $156 million. We then looked at if the feasibility gap was narrowed and the project moved forward, how impactful could a project like this be to Kenmore? What kind of economic and fiscal benefits could it create? And for the developer proposed program, the one-time impact, so those occurring based on construction activity, could generate up to $1.9 billion in economic impact, up to 12,655 jobs through complete construction, and generate up to $16.5 million in fiscal revenues. On an ongoing basis, at stabilization, the project could generate up to $1.5 billion in annual economic impact, support approximately 4,360 full-time jobs, or full-time equivalent jobs, and generate up to $2.5 million in fiscal revenues. So we said, to achieve those benefits, what public policy levers can we explore to narrow this gap? And we tested a set of public policy levers, including reduced parking requirements, those shown in the HR&A alternative, resulting in that lower number of parking units, a reduction in or waiver of or other contribution for impact fees, an abatement of property taxes, and then the opportunity to consider changing affordable housing requirements, which is not shown here today, but is a lever that's available to test in our model, including changing the percentage AMI required for affordable housing, or considering an off-site versus on-site affordable housing option. Taking each of these in turn, reduced parking requirements has the potential to reduce the project gap by approximately $18 million based on reduced construction costs associated with parking. Exempting Lakepointe from transportation and park impact fees may reduce the gap by $15 to $16 million. Abating property taxes to incentivize multifamily construction may reduce the feasibility gap significantly by approximately $31 to $32 million based on our analysis. I should just note that our analysis captures the project to stabilization, but not the full length of the property tax abatement, the full value of which is closer to $60 million. And while this would limit the city's fiscal revenues in the near term, we've assumed that this is only on residential property, and so there is still fiscal revenue flowing from the other properties on site.
Can I comment or clarify on that previous slide real quick? I just wanted to clarify that the property tax rebate is for multifamily property or constructed buildings only. And so the city would still receive property tax on the land and also any commercial components to the project. So this is just for the multifamily buildings.
The point that Olivia was making is that footnote down at the bottom of the slide. You can see that the value of the property tax abatement is closer to 60 million, but because of the timeline of the model, the timeline of the model doesn't capture the full 60, and so that's why you see the 31 to 32 million number instead.
So in that analysis, because that's on the improvements only, the abatement, do you actually then calculate the increased value of the land versus, which right now it's assessed significantly lower than what it would be after it's been developed, and capture that delta in there?
Yes, so the value of the abatement is based on the projected property tax for the project once it's built, so the improved land and property.
Okay. So, but the abatement part's only on the improvement, so you also factor in that there's additional taxes still received, though, for the land portion only.
The total tax should factor in the valuation of the land and the property. Yeah.
Okay.
And improvement. I can double check that, but yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Councilmember Smith, are you asking if her calculation included the tax of the land and the commercial component?
Yeah, it's basically, I'm just going to throw a number out, but let's say it's valued right now at $100,000 an acre on the property taxes. Well, once it's developed, that may be $10,000 an acre for the underlying land value because it has all the infrastructure improvements and everything. And what I was trying to understand is that additional tax revenue, is that calculated in the revenue portion of their analysis?
Yes, I think it is.
Yeah.
You were answering yes?
Yes, so we calculate. Yes. We don't break out the land versus improvement tax, I think, in the model. We just have the property tax together and then all tax revenue to the city, but it should capture the full value and full tax rate applied. So then we said if we achieved half of the maximum value of all policy levers, so if we assume that we can get part of the way on each of these or all the way on some of them, what would the remaining project gap be? And assuming just the values that we just went through, we would reduce the project gap by a little over $30 million to $101 to $132 million. So a significant reduction, but still a sizable gap. And as we think about why the city would grant these policy levers and benefits to the project, we understand that the city may also require the delivery of specific benefits, including having input into the size and quality of open space on the site, the amount and level of affordable housing required on or off-site, the integration of transit improvements and transit on-site with off-site improvements, and potentially other benefits that we can discuss with you tonight. And all of these may then add to the project gap, requiring the city and the Weidner team to continue solving toward a strategy to narrow. As they think about moving forward in this strategy, we believe that this will require a collaborative pursuit of regional funding outside of the levers that the city may have and tools the city may have to explore, but importantly with the support of both the city and the Weidner team and other project supporters, and potentially rephasing of the investment and thinking about how we narrow the gap as much as possible based on how the project is built. If interests are aligned and the city and Weidner team can move toward narrowing the project gap together and toward those other solutions that might help to mitigate the gap together, we would recommend moving toward a negotiation development agreement. And that's where we are, and we're happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, now's the time if you have any questions about the feasibility and benefits study. We have a large panel of experts here, so we can answer regional, national, situations.
Councilmember Smith.
Yeah, I have a question on page 7. Let's see. When you were talking about the reduced parking requirements, what I'm curious, and it was noted as a lever for closing the feasibility gap, but does your analysis then actually include that diminished? You've already included a reduced parking requirement in your analysis, in addition to potentially doing it, having more of a reduction later?
So for the HR&A alternative, the parking ratios are at that reduced alternative, where we show the shift in, or the reduction in, the reduction in the gap. It is applying those reduced parking ratios to the developer proposed program.
Okay.
Can I comment on the reduced parking ratios? And so without having a project in place and without knowing what the scope of this project is, I'm not certain if it's a deviation from our current code at this point. So going through the parameter agreements and other discussions with the developer, we'll have those further discussions on what, if there's any need for having that reduced parking language in there, or a future development agreement. So I know that when people hear that there's a reduced parking ratio, that they might think, well, they're going below what code requires, and I'm not sure yet.
So on that, then, and I don't know if this would be part of the parameter agreement or just general information, but when I assume as it goes forward, there will be shifts in residential units versus office space versus retail, and I understand it's fluid in that dynamic, but it's hard for us to understand when we're given a particular parking, saying that there's 3,200 required spaces. We don't know where that reduction is taking place, knowing that each one of those improvements, whether it's commercial, office, or residential, may have a different requirement. So it'd be really beneficial if there are changes going on, that we have some matrix or relative basis to look at to understand what's being deviated from, whether it is on the office component, whether it's retail component, or what's being asked to be deviated from.
I'm happy just to clarify what we tested, which was a reduction in the developer proposed program from 1.35 spaces per unit to 1 space per residential unit. And then leaving the office space at 3 spaces per 1,000 square feet and retail at 3 spaces per 1,000 square feet, which is slightly lower than the CSDP requirement of 3.3 spaces per 1,000 square feet.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Curtis.
So it seems like one of the biggest differences between the two proposals is whether a hotel is put in or not. I guess the question is, over the next couple of years, as you're working toward actually submitting plans and a request, what information would you use to make that final decision to include or not include a hotel?
Well, we would really be looking at the market that we're attracting. We tend to think that a hotel would add an awful lot in that waterfront sort of wharf side area, the inner harbor area, because it would actually bring a restaurant or several, as well as obviously accommodations. There certainly would be a ability to serve wine and other drinks, and that's a big plus in that environment. And we feel like once the project is 2/3 underway, it's going to be so attractive that people are going to want to stay there and actually spend a weekend there.
Thank you.
I know on the hotel issue real quick, I know our regional representative has a thought process on hotels, and maybe you want to elaborate.
Oh, yes. Yes. I would be fairly confident that over the time frame for this development, there would be a hotel.
Its timing would be subject to market conditions. You know, everything comes into play there, what the rooms rent for, the cost to build, but it's such an attractive spot for a hotel that I believe there would eventually be one. The question might be how big of a hotel or what kind of a hotel, but I believe there'd be a hotel.
So, still another take on the question. I think Brian's almost certainly right that over the course of the development period there would be a hotel. Under current market conditions, it looks like it's so far out that the revenue attributable to it doesn't amount to much in the model. But I have a client in Denver who listened to me deliver a similar kind of market analysis and said to me, you know, I hate these market analyses because they look at the condition of what everybody else is doing out there, and what I'm committed to doing is delivering the very best product there is. So you can tell me there's no retail demand in the market, but I'm going to put better retail in the market, and my retail will drive out other people's retail out of business because it will be better. In a city that doesn't have a hotel product, that's certainly something to aspire to.
Kind of a related question. How many years out does your model actually predict? Because there was the one issue with
So,
the taxes not being all captured.
so it works over a 10-year build period, but the parcels and phases are phased on over those 10 years.
So if the income is predicted more than 10 years out, it wouldn't show up in your model.
Each parcel is stabilized at year 5, and so we don't capture every parcel within it.
Okay.
Councilmember Danuski.
Yeah, I had a general question for Brian Connor. We haven't heard from you yet or seen what you've done, so can you just kind of give a small recap of what you've looked at and what you found?
Yes. So what I looked at, as this process was going on with HR&A, at some points of the process, I was able to help and provide local data that they didn't have available. Things like what a condo may sell for, or a more accurate rental rate on apartments, or something like that. So during that process, I was able to feed some data to help them, hopefully. As the model was getting built, I and people who work for me went over the model looking for any miscalculations or any mistakes that could be made. It was a very complex economic model. It was one of the most complex I've ever gone over. And, you know, of course, we always, you know, people are people, so we found a few things that we could fix and improve in the math. So it was an oversight sort of assignment.
He was astonishingly helpful at allowing us to understand particularly how the local fiscal regime works and whether we were estimating how an abatement worked properly or when a particular tax would be assessed and applied and those kinds of corrections that a national certainly isn't going to get. And to have a talented local partner is fantastic.
Thank you.
Can I?
Marshall.
Has HR&A done any studies or incorporated into its studies, and is it familiar with any other anticipated or planned properties or projects like or unlike this that are adjacent to industrial sites?
Yes, lots, all over the country. It's more and more, those are the sites that are available. And in successful urbanizing areas like this one, there are very, very few greenfield sites left. And so this is what people are building on, and it creates the need for partnership because of site conditions.
And are there any design or aesthetic or structural elements that you see or don't see in projects that are being built next to or planned next to those sites to address them aesthetically or not?
You might have to push us a little harder with the question. I think brownfields are created just by the economy that we had in the last 100 years. And we know so much about brownfield remediation at this point that sites have been successfully remediated all over the country. And except that as a historical fact that we use our waterfronts, for instance, as places of employment, and now we're using them as places of habitation and enjoyment, you would never know. I guess it may not be where you were going with the question, but there are certainly sites, for instance, we're working on the Central Waterfront in Seattle now, where there's an embrace of the ongoing industry and a seeking to try and keep a working waterfront functioning next to a 21st century waterfront, and thinking about how those uses can be operated side by side, and where the industrial aesthetic is in fact celebrated and made part of delivering a mixed-use product. I think, given the neighbors, that's something that we would want to explore, certainly that they would want to explore, you will want to explore here.
The one addition I would make to that, and that is particular to this site, but that we see on some others that sit in sort of positions similar to this in their relationship to downtown and proximity to industrial or former industrial sites, is the need for a strong connective elements and strong connections to downtown or to corridors of strength. And I think that we see that in many projects, and it's one of the reasons here that we feel that, the retail component and a mix of uses here is so important, that there be, services and amenities on site to really make it a vibrant place when you're there, but also sort of destination-worthy uses that will draw people there and create connections to all of the great energy that you've started in downtown.
Mr. Weidner, do you have any response to that question?
Well, I think she's right on. You've got to have that population in order to drive some of these uses, and obviously that's what we're doing with townhomes, condos, and apartments. And at the same time, through the hotel particularly, you're driving people to this area to create that vibrant environment. And then the final aspect of it, of course, is some office, because that's where some of your jobs are. And as you know from your own planning sessions, the whole business of planning these days really is to try and cut down extensive trips and rather have walkable environments and bikeable environments and that type of situation, which a mixed use accomplishes.
City Manager.
Thank you, Your Honor. More questions for Bryan O'Connor. We hired you to be that second set of eyes, kind of the local, regional expert on these kind of things. You see big real estate deals happening all over the region. So what's your sense of Lakepointe, based on what you know about it, based on what you're seeing of the numbers and the site? Also, given the fact that I think this might be over the last several decades, this might be the third or fourth time you've been asked to look at Lakepointe. So you've got a lot of experience not only in the region, but also with Lakepointe. You've been brought in to look at the numbers for Lakepointe several times over the last several decades. So did you just put up four fingers? Mm-hmm. So this is your fourth time at Lakepointe? So you've always been brought in as an independent consultant without anything invested in the property, right?
Of course, yeah.
Right, and so given this is your fourth time and given what you've seen in other deals, what odds do you give this project? What's your general sense of whether this project can happen or not?
Okay. Let me put it this way. If the sponsor or developer of this project was a more typical type of developer that didn't have all the equity himself, had a little bit of the equity. Most developers have 5 to 10% of the required equity. They go out, they bring in equity partners, or they basically borrow equity and then they got to get debt. If it was that type of developer, I would give this a very low probability of ever happening. Because right now it's very hard to see, put it in plain terms, it's very hard to see how it makes money today. And there's a lot of work left that needs to be figured out how this plan comes together. But when a developer goes out to get equity and get debt, they have to show the feasibility of the project and how it's going to pay back the money and how the partners are going to get a return. And right now, you really couldn't be able to do that. As you can see, there's a net loss right now. So it takes a unique company, unique individual that's willing to put in those very significant dollars early on to be able to solve those problems at this scale. This is a very, very large scale project. I've worked on 2 other projects on Lake Washington. One was a big piece of ground owned by Paul Allen, and we looked at same kind of issues, and he decided to build the Seahawks training facility on that piece. So he found a higher, better use for himself. The other one is 180 degrees from Kenmore. It's down in Renton on the waterfront, the new hotel with the office building behind it. We did a lot of work on that too. That was fundamentally done with we call it EB5 money. That's basically, in this case, it was mostly Chinese money, and that's the way that project got launched and got off the ground. So you can see that's kind of unique in itself to bring in that much money. This project has so many moving pieces to it. It has, the apartments, the retail, the hotel, office, everything else. It would be very hard today to go out and bring those dollars in from other people. You'd have to have a whole lot of work done to be able to show how this thing is feasible before you'd be able to bring in any partners. So if it was just a regular development firm out there, I'd probably say it probably wouldn't happen. With Mr. Weidner saying he's going to step up and kind of put in the early money like this or all the money, then I have to give it a much better chance, because that's usually what stops projects. It's usually the money that stops them, not the market can make them pause for a little while if there's a downturn, but it usually doesn't stop them permanently.
Councilmember Shrubnik.
I have a question for HR&A and then one for Dean Weidner. I'll start with the HR&A question. So just working with your spreadsheets, at what point does a reduction in the number of units translate to a reduction in the horizontal costs?
So this is something that, to understand the relationship between the reduction in units and horizontal cost, i.e. the site stabilization costs in particular, we would really need to work with engineer and cost estimator.
Okay.
We did test just the impact of just reducing the residential units, which not surprisingly increases the feasibility gap. And when you look at the breakdown of the horizontal costs, the site stabilization costs, while significant and potentially movable, though we don't know how much, are only a fraction of the total costs in that about $230 million bar. And while they may move, others, including the transportation improvements required to bring access onto and through the site, the environmental remediation requirements, certainly the landscaping and things that deliver the great open space you saw in Dean's vision plan, wouldn't change.
Right. Okay. That's helpful. Thank you. And for Mr. Weidner, can you talk a little bit about how you are thinking about the affordable unit concept, the percentage of affordable required in the underlying zoning versus what you're thinking about, how that might be distributed across the multifamily versus owner occupied, that kind of thing?
Affordable housing is a little bit difficult issue And then you've heard from Bryan that there are already financial restraints on the site, and that means that a developer has to generate the kind of income to try and recoup his money. We certainly would provide an affordable component, whether it was actually on-site or off-site. We don't know at this point. It's really problematical, but we certainly would be willing to provide a affordable element. I would remind the council, though, that the extent of affordability, if you make it more and more affordable, that simply increases the gap and increases the difficulty in doing the project.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Councilmember Smith.
Yes, since this is with the HR&A analysis, I do have a question, and it has to do with the horizontal costs, and it somewhat piggybacks on what Councilmember Shrubnik was talking about, and that has to do with when you analyze the CDSP, you said the gap was too big, or basically too big to analyze. Is that so? When I look at this, though, the part I can't get over, it seems like we've still increased the scale of the development, and yet we've just removed the transportation infrastructure costs because they're too difficult to analyze, and yet wouldn't that put the gap at like $250 million or something if you actually bring that back in there?
So I just want to clarify that the CSDP horizontal costs and the transportation improvement cost or budget is a different strategy for transportation improvements on the site than is in the Weidner proposal and the HR&A alternative. We didn't generate either set of costs, but we discussed them extensively with the Weidner team to understand what was in both. And so it's not just removing elements of the transportation improvements, it's really just a different approach to bringing transportation or transit into the
So what
city.
is that based on then? You have to base it on something, and the CSDP was actually based on, they had their traffic studies, and that's how they arrived at the transportation mitigation agreement. I'm just trying to understand how do you just pull out $150 million and not analyze it without being clear on what your relative basis is to work from?
So I'll let the Weidner team speak
Sure.
to it if useful, but
I can speak to the fact that the CSDP program was a much heavier and much more intense retail use, several 100,000 square feet of, movie theaters, sports clubs that were big traffic demand drivers. So getting all of those cars and trips and parking spaces associated with that shifted you to a completely different site plan. It was effectively 2 to 3 stories of structured parking across the entire site with a 5-lane major elevated arterial, much like almost like a viaduct going through the site. So the cost of all of that to bring all of that access in was such a huge driver over a lower density program when you look at residential and office as well.
Okay, and so then is that basically compared to then what every one of those site improvements, those traffic infrastructure improvements, are directly corresponding to those trips derived in the percentage for residential, for office, and for retail construction?
What we did is we worked with consultants to cost that specific set of traffic improvements, that specific approach to parking and accessing and all of those things. So
and is that an approach that would be commonly used without a development agreement, or is that an approach that somebody would arrive at and the level of investment that they arrived at is relative to what would require some reduction in what transportation requirements would be required once it goes through a full vetting?
I'm not sure I completely understand
I'm trying
question.
So when you compared it to, you said you had a consultant that
Right.
looked at it. I'm trying to understand, did that consultant look at it that said, okay, here's what the industry standard is for you're so many 100,000 of office space, of retail, and 1,800 or 1,650 dwelling units. did he base all of those infrastructure improvements based on what he was provided to in that environment? Or did he say, okay, here's what ideally you should have, but we're going to step it back a bit?
So that CSDP was accompanied with a pretty defined plan set that really showed quite a bit of detail. So he worked with traffic engineers, civil engineers, relied on, some public works standards, assumptions for WashDOT, what is the cost to make a public arterial. A lot of that data was factored into that. So it was directly tied to that site plan that the CSDP was based on.
May I?
No, I understand on the CSDP, but I'm trying to understand when you got the diminished transportation infrastructure costs, what are those based on?
Sure, it's similar assumptions, working with traffic engineers, civil engineers on our envisioned infrastructure plan, which was bringing the road down to grade, different approach to parking, not the elevated 5-lane arterial running through the middle of the site and connecting to 522.
And you're confident, based on what you're told there, that those diminished costs will stand up under the scrutiny of
Yeah, we worked with a team of consultants on this and put quite a bit of effort into it. It is a cost estimate, and costs are constantly moving. But yes, I would say we worked with a highly skilled group of consultants and have spent now well over a year, 2 years working on that. So.
Okay, and then just so to finally don't want to dwell too much on it, but this is an immensely critical part of this analysis. So that $150 million then is essentially driven by the reduction in the retail alone. I mean, because if you look at the breakdown in the CSDP, there's 277,000 in retail, and the proposal is 126. So it's like just under half, 50%. But yet you have almost a 50% or 30% increase in residential units, and then also a significant increase in office. And I still am having a hard time believing that small, that reduction in retail is enough to offset the increase in residential dwelling units, as well as, almost a 2- or 3-fold in office.
Can I drag here in?
Yeah.
I think what we're seeing around the country is when development teams like theirs put together these first estimates, they're entirely driven by the program, entirely. And it's a conversation between the developer and their traffic engineers about what the developer believes the market will bear in terms of parking for kind of development program. And in markets like this one that are urbanizing but still suburban, most developers are cautious about accepting what in fact is most engineers' judgment that we're becoming less and less car-centric, and there's going to be more and more alternatives available to us that will require less and less parking. So in most of these dynamics in which I'm in, it's the developer side of the table that tends to be more conservative about cutting the parking numbers, particularly in a market like this. So that's one. Two, the fact that they've moved from from the CSDP program, which was overwhelmingly retail, to this overwhelmingly residential program, will radically decrease the amount of parking. And that's kind of a math problem that we could show you in pretty much any market anywhere. But I think the third thing that's happening that we're not taking into consideration is time. So the CSDP program is 20 years old. When I did 20 years ago a mixed-use program like this with a heavy retail component 20 years ago in Boulder, Walmart was demanding 8 parking spaces per 1,000 square feet. We're running it at 3.3 now, which some people would say is still a little high in some markets. So it's all of those dynamics. It's a radically changed program. It's whatever the discussion between the developer and their traffic engineers was, and it's the fact that our use of cars has changed, and none of apartment dwellers, major retailers, hoteliers are demanding as many spaces as they used to.
I have a little bit more comment on that. Taking consideration the CSDP. It was a different model. For example, the roadway, the Lakepointe Boulevard that Dean and Kieran are talking about, the multi-level boulevard, or similar to the viaduct, that was designed to be a pass-through boulevard so people could actually cut through and not get to the intersection. So it had a whole bunch, a larger volume of traffic that was going through, that it wasn't just going to the site. And secondly, when developers typically start a development, let's just say it's a plat to approve a multi-lot housing plat, short or long, we have a set of underlying rules, road standards that they would look at, and they'd look at how many houses that road would serve, and we'd have a standard to build that road. But nowhere in our code we would have a standard such as a viaduct or a 5-lane multi-lane highway that would need to be built as it's outlined in the CSDP. And so when you're looking at the infrastructure needed to support a use, we would look at how many people are getting generated by trips to that use, and then we would assign a road structure or infrastructure structure to that type of use, and so just doing that alone reduces it a substantial amount from 150 to 100 down to $100 million. So that had a completely different animal when you're looking at the CSDP and what it was functioning as and how it was required to be designed.
Thank you.
Councilmember Curtis.
Related question. Do we have any pictures of those old designs? Because I sort of remember those, and it was like massive.
We do. We actually have planned sets of an approved CSDP
I think that would
program.
help people to see the change in the transportation, why it's so much less than it was before.
I even know where the 3D model is. And I'm looking at Gary Sargent in the audience. He has it in his office.
Councilmember Smith.
I have one last question on this, and it was on slide 7 when you said, and I can see it from your analysis, that you analyzed it to maximize the residential development component. And I get that completely. I understand why there's more economic benefit to that. My only thought was that that probably has the least community benefit, though, even though it drives the feasibility to close the gap from a community perspective, and knowing there's community dollars by diminishing the retail aspect, which your own analysis showed is deficient here. I think that's an important part to understand, that by increasing that takes away from some of the public benefit. There is some benefit, without a doubt, to having it, but maximizing that changes the equation a bit.
Can I make a comment on that, Councilman? What cities really need to be successful, and particularly a mixed-use environment needs to be successful, are people. And you really need to have them on site. In fact, that's what allows you to have a 18-hour type of environment. That's what allows you to have the walking in the streets and the friendliness that comes along with that. So the residential density is just absolutely critical to the success of the area.
Any other questions?
I have a comment on residential density. The underlying P suffixes in the CSDP, well, not the CSDP, that's a permit, but the underlying zoning code, you could still get a range up to 600. I think at the low end is 600 units, up to 1,800 units based on the underlying zoning code.
I want to mention something about office that we're talking about. You may look at these office plans at 357,000 versus 600 as they're a lot of office. They're really not very much office. There's probably more demand for office right now than there has been in many years. One example would be what's going on in Kirkland right now. Google's expanding the current campus by 400,000 feet. and that's not enough. So they're moving into the new building that's under construction, Kirkland Urban, taking 600,000. Google's going into Kirkland with an additional 1 million square feet. That's a lot of space. So doing 350 or doing 600,000, I don't see that as any problem at all. It's probably pretty easy to do that.
Anything else?
Yeah, we've, going back to the CSDP, it is pretty big. If you compare, for example, if you compare the CSDP to Carillon Point, it's like Carillon Point on steroids, as Nancy and I often say. So just to give you a sense of how big the current approved CSDP is. Question for Mr. Weidner. If you can go back to your site plan on your, oh, no, let's see, we've got the HR&A model up. If you can go to the Weidner site plan.
Back about, there you go.
Yeah, so I guess my main question, as we get into discussing the parameter agreement and ultimately a development agreement, do you see some flexibility there in how we shift things around? For example, I haven't seen the geotechnical analysis of the site, but my guess is that further west you go, the squishier the soil gets. And so would it make sense to maximize open space and park space closer out towards the tip of the peninsula and move the bigger buildings back farther east? So questions like that, are you open to questions and suggestions like that?
Yes, and in fact, some of the larger buildings you would move back to the east and particularly the northeast corner there, but you have to keep in mind that as you get to the western area, that's also your most valuable property. And if you start cutting back on getting a return on your most valuable property, the gap widens pretty quickly.
Councilmember Curtis.
There's a cement plant and an asphalt plant right next to the site.
Yes.
Was wondering what kind of thoughts you have on working with those folks.
Well, Gary Sargent, who is the controlling person on this site, has a option to purchase that site at some point in the future, and that point isn't 20 years from now. It's more like perhaps 10. In fact, one of the key things here to make the site successful is you want to have that concrete plant operating to produce the kind of concrete you need for this particular site.
Great. Thank you.
Councilmember Smith.
Well, our city manager hit on the note on the open space, and I know we touched on this at the last meeting, but I would like to comment that I do think the greatest public benefit is to have that park at the western point and not in the middle of the project. You have a large central park identified on the site plan, and which is great if you are looking straight out to the river. But I would say that knowing that we have to go through trying to determine what public benefit is and what all the different components in a development plan, I just think as we look at where is the greatest public benefit, it would appear to be at the western edge that isn't shadowed. And so that's something that I think as you're reconfiguring whatever you reconfigure, I would think that would be something that would be probably meaningful to at least look at and see what kind of options can be done there. Thank you.
Yes.
Anyone else? Councilmember Curtis.
Just one last comment. As far as public benefit, we've had multiple studies over the 10 years I've been on the council, and it's the thing I hear the most is we want access to the water. So I think the main public benefit that I really want to see is people be able to get to the shoreline. And you have lots of space for people to do that. So I think that's absolutely critical to meet the needs of what Kenmore citizens are asking for.
Thank you.
Any further questions? Comments? Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you. We are looking for direction. One, acceptance of the pro forma.
That's the next item on the
I thought you were
agenda.
sending us off.
No, no, because you're up on that one. And I don't know the rest of the table is up on that one. So anyway, let's move on then to the business agenda and possible action to accept HR&A's advisor's feasibility and benefit study and direction on a parameter agreement with the Weidner Apartments homes on a new Lakepointe project. So, Mr. Hampson.
Thank you. So if there's not any other further questions for us, I would like to recommend that you give us direction to go forward and draft a parameter agreement with the developer, the Weidner Group. And if it's so desired, we could also bring back a draft to City Council before showing it to the public and Weidner Group, just to make sure that we're on the same page and we're not completely off the mark.
Any further questions or comments?
Just for clarification, do you want comments on input on a parameter agreement right now? Oh, well, I have lots, but I'll let somebody else speak.
Anybody else? Anybody who hasn't spoken yet? Councilmember Curtis.
So I guess it's unclear to me from what you just stated whether you actually need a whole bunch of details or just in concept, go forth and prosper, bring us back something that we can really comment on in more detail.
Either way, you're going to get to comment again on the parameter agreement, but it would be helpful for us for now if you had some high-level ideas, such as Councilmember Smith and others had, that you could let us know at least what to kind of get started with so we're in the right neighborhood.
I have been relatively silent, but I certainly have looked at the parking requirements. And given 3,600 spaces, 5,000 spaces, it seems to me that's going to put a tremendous load on the streets in the area. And so I would certainly love to have a better understanding of that. You know, whether it came into a traffic analysis or whatever, I would love to have a better understanding, because to me, that's a heck of a lot of parking spaces.
Understood. Let me circle back with the team and the developer group and see what kind of information we can put together that would help you better understand what this means.
Councilmember Shrevenick?
If we're starting to enumerate things, I think it would be helpful to understand the impact on view corridors and public open space of various height and volume of unit options. Leave it at that.
View corridors from on-site, or are you thinking from off-site?
522 up Lake, I mean, looking on to this thing that is going to be built.
Deputy Mayor.
Kind of going off what the mayor was brought up earlier, I would hope that as we look at potential traffic mitigation, we also are factoring in future transit improvements as well as the access to the Burke-Gilman Trail, just as we look at the overall traffic situation on the site.
and the potential for passenger-only ferry and how that would affect things. Councilmember Curtis?
I think sort of a subset of that is to specifically look at how we can coordinate with ST3, because I think that will affect your parking requirements and how those are met.
Councilmember Danuski?
You already mentioned that you were going to do this, but one thing that would be helpful when a development or a parameter agreement comes out is just to have that matrix of P suffixes and, just at least generally what we're meeting, what we're not. And then for me, visual helps. So as far as when we're talking parks, we're talking range of units, even a couple sketches on the back of a napkin could help me a bit.
Visual help with maybe the overall height and 3D
If we're talking
look.
densities and this and that, what does 1,200 units versus 1,600 units versus 2,000 units really look like? Wouldn't have to be anything complicated, but just general.
I had an idea, but I'm not going to share it right now.
Okay. Thank you.
Councilmember Marshall?
A range of potential contributions to on-site or off-site indoor aquatic recreation facilities. A range of impacts and or mitigation measures for lake traffic to include boating and aerospace traffic. A potential or a range for potential monitoring of emissions from neighboring industry and potential effects on proposed inhabitants of this project. And a range of, study for potential impacts on salmon passage as it relates to any increased marine traffic in the project.
Councilmember Danuski, I think, had something.
No, I already spoke.
Okay, fine. Councilmember Smith?
Okay. Well, first I'll tackle the, we're accepting the HR&A analysis, and I'd just like to thank you for coming the last 2 times and everything, and since we're accepting that report, I appreciate all the work that went into it. I do think I'm fine with accepting it, but I also think it's lacking in discussing a scaled-back version of what Lakepointe could be. I feel like that should have been something that was part of the analysis, and maybe it would have showed a smaller gap, depending on where the development took place. So that's the first thing I would like to add. On the parameter agreement, I'm going to go through a few things that I wrote down, but and some of them we've already covered, so I'll try to not mention those. But the reason I would prefer to be more detailed than less is because I think this is one of our best opportunities to get the Weidner Group and us as a council generally, on the same page with expectations of where we think, since we know the next phase is the development agreement, I feel like it makes the most sense to have as much out there and that can be a part of the agreement as possible. And so first I'd just like to echo the thoughts on the P suffix. I think that's important that we understand what's already been deviated from current code in that. And so in the parameter agreement, if we could outline what those deviations already are and any current future ones so we would know what they are. I would like it to address as much as possible how the increased density will relate to the traffic and increased density in all 3 components of the plan, residential, retail, and office. On the community benefit part, I think it needs to call that out specifically as a significant component, because we know any development agreement will have to have a real community benefit. And within that, the subsection, I think it's worth at least considering an enhanced open space that's over and above what's already required. Since we will be contributing public dollars, it should be over and above what's already required in the P suffixes. It should recognize the view corridors and understand that a diminished retail component is a diminished public benefit, and that there's a public benefit in having more owner-occupancy, owner-occupied units. Then I realize that a significant part of how you operate is the non-owner occupied or rental market, but I do believe that giving people a different stake in ownership in the project and the community is derived from having a higher percentage of owner occupancy in there. I think the scale of the open space relative to the project is important, and I think as you analyze that scale, I think, well, I'll just leave it at that. I think the parameter agreement has to call out the recognition that there are impacts to increasing any development scale above and beyond what the CSDP approval was, and that there are impacts to neighboring properties, whether it's residential, business, whatever it is. That needs to be called out specifically, that needs to be addressed when we're deviating from any code or current P suffix ordinances. I think the parameter agreement, and this is an important part, and it touched a little bit on what we talked about at the last meeting. I think it needs to specifically recognize that on the legal non-conforming use of the heavy industry, that it's already terminated on a major portion of the site, and that we understand that we want to, as a city, we understand there's a different zoning, and that that can impact what can be done on the site. The P suffix aside, the zoning change to regional business impacts how we look at it going forward, and a parameter agreement should call that out. It talked about, in the analysis, and I don't know if this will be in the parameter agreement or not, about flexibility. And I just hope as we deal with flexibility that we have flexibility with definitive metrics, so that at least if we are going to shift from one component to another as we move forward, that we all are on the same page as understanding what those impacts derived from that flexibility are, so that it again gets to expectations, so that we're all on the same page. I'd like to see clearly defined parking, whatever it is. I'm not saying what you need to do to deviate from it, but I think we all need to understand precisely when we deviate from it, how does that impact the overall program. And it's one of the levers called out in the analysis, and so any deviation from that, I think it benefits everybody to just understand what the impact is, so we're all on the same page with parking deviations. On looking at building heights and project densities, I do think, and it was touched on a little bit by Councilmember Danuski, is that if we can have, as a community, have visuals to understand what those impacts are, both from architectural elevations to maybe 360 viewpoints from different spots in the project as we're starting to move through those discussions. I think that benefits everybody to set a standard expectation of what they can visually expect, just like you had elevations in the presentation tonight, which is nice because that helps us all understand what we're looking at and what we may be addressing going forward. And then on the, I don't know if you're going to, I don't know how much detail you get into in the parameter agreement on workables as far as the revenue side and what helps close the feasibility gap, but I would say pretty much everything that was called out in the analysis all appear to be relatively reasonable workables to at least look at and see how do you close that viability gap, and that includes everything from, well, it's the sales tax, city portion of the sales tax, tax abatement issue, the impact fees on park and transportation. Were those planning on being in there anyway as workables in that parameter agreement? I don't know, but I'm assuming, I don't want to assume anything, so that's why I'm calling that specific.
We were thinking that the parameter agreement would have some considerations that the city could use to lower those gaps, such as those that you mentioned.
Okay. And then lastly on that, definitely agree with trying to change the structure of the horizontal phasing of it, and maybe there's a way to make that more financially feasible, in a different phasing process rather than having everything completed up front. That might close that gap a little bit. Even to the point of having a standalone first phase that was also discussed. I think that's appealing. And then that's it. Thank you for listening.
Good timing.
Councilmember Curtis.
I had one thing to add. Looking at boating safety, so we'll be adding more boat trips down there, more people, and with the planes landing, I assume that would be part of one of the issues we'd look at.
City Manager.
A couple things I did not hear, but maybe that's because they go without saying. But affordable housing is probably something you want. That promenade and river trail that goes around the whole site, that's already up there on the plan. So those are in the waterfront viewpoints. Those are things you would like considered.
And certainly affordable housing in the scale that we're finding a huge gap in, and that's the 30 to 50% of AMI.
30 to 50% AMI? You'd like the developer to consider that?
Well, I think yes, because there's such a great need. We're over 100,000 homes short in the county, and I certainly don't expect to make that up. But there's a tremendous shortage of affordable housing down at that level, and we have the opportunity to provide some.
Can I make a comment on that, if you don't mind? So I know the code requires it was 10% at 50% AMI. Well, I would say in the parameter agreement, I think it would be a lot easier to quantify and to understand if we tried to keep it a little simpler on all the different variations on the AMI percentage and looked at maybe total units based at like 50%. And then that way, maybe we can back into a different breakout later. But the problem is as soon as you change the number of units, everything changes depending on what the AMI is, and it becomes very confusing very fast. And so I would like us to stay with, and I know you suggested 30. I think that's a little low, but at least 50%, and I see no point in going any higher than that on the AMI, and at least it allows us to have a better understanding of what we're talking about as far as comparing apples to apples.
Yes, but I don't want to overlook ARCH and the contributions we've made over the years to ARCH. which could help bring that down to 30%, because many, many seniors are so cost burdened by housing that I think that it behooves us to at least consider that. Councilmember Shrubnik.
So the two things that you mentioned, City Manager, are both part of the P suffix conditions. The affordable unit requirement is 10% of total at 50% AMI for rental and 80% for owner occupied. And the perimeter public open space around the entire perimeter is another P suffix condition. So I think that will go, I mean, assuming that we get the matrix that you were talking about, those would be part of the considerations in the parameter agreement, as I'm understanding what you're talking about.
Yep.
Yeah.
Anything else? Councilmember Marshall.
Deviate quickly, just a real quick question for the Weidner team. What is the gray area in the northeast corner of the present diagram that fronts on Bothell Way and Juanita there? Was that just, was it?
Well, at the time that we did this particular drawing, we did not own those properties. We subsequently have bought those properties, and so now they would be included.
I would add, we also left them unplanned, thinking it could be a potential space or location for ST3 parking garage, and trying to coordinate development with ST3 and the rapid ride.
Any other comments, questions?
I guess you all came up with a list of things, and so am I to come back with a draft that has all of that in it?
Heading in that direction.
Okay. Because I need at least 4 of you to give me guidance on.
That's the direction I'm heading.
Okay.
So if there's no further questions or comments at this point, the chair will entertain a motion to accept the HR&A Advisor's Feasibility and Benefits Study and give the city manager and a direction on pursuing a parameter agreement with Weidner Apartments Homes on a new Lakepointe project.
I so move.
Is there a second?
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any further questions or comments?
Yeah, I guess.
Please.
I would say that we would want to consider all the comments that we had here, but I wouldn't say that everything would have to be in the parameter agreement. There were a bunch of things that came up that have kind of never come up before, so I wouldn't necessarily think they'd all be addressed, but at least considered. That's kind of where I was thinking.
Right, but I also would think that there's other things that we have not mentioned.
Correct.
That could possibly be in that parameter agreement, so.
All right.
Any further comments? Clerk, take the roll on the motion in front of us.
Councilmember Smith?
Yes.
Councilmember Marshall?
Yes.
Councilmember Curtis?
Yes.
Councilmember Shrubnik?
Yes.
Mayor Baker?
Yes.
Deputy Mayor Herbig?
Yes.
Councilmember Danuski?
Yes.
Right, motion passes unanimously. So you will bring this back to us at some point here, and possibly October?
With the list of all these things.
Yes.
But considering all of them, not in them. We just.
Do you want them in the draft or not? Because our plan is to bring you back a draft.
Yeah, well,
You want all these things in that draft?
we want you to consider them.
Not necessarily.
It's not up to me to consider them. You are the ones considering them.
Once we see the draft, then I guess we will be able
Okay.
to consider them.
I guess we might need to.
There was a lot of comments here, and
I have a suggestion.
please.
So how about if you do the draft with the things we've kind of been discussing and the things that were common themes, but like have this list of all the random things we just mentioned tonight, so we can at least compare the two, because we will forget all the little details. And then we can say, oh yeah, that one thing one person mentioned, it's okay, we can leave that off. It's not in the parameter agreement.
Okay.
But if somebody could just give me a list at the end of the 50 or whatever things we just brought up. some might have been for the first time.
Because there are a lot of things mentioned that are more appropriate for a development agreement and not necessarily a more high-level parameter agreement. And so I'm already personally disagreeing with several items that were brought up because I think they're too early. They're not appropriate for a parameter agreement.
So that would be what the response would be. You would have a parameter agreement with the things that are appropriate for parameter agreement and the appendix that says these are other things that were mentioned and here's why they're not in there.
I can do that, yeah.
Yeah, we're not looking for a development agreement here. We're after the parameter agreement. You're the one that certainly knows that. So.
Councilmember Smith? Since I probably contributed to this agonizing discussion as much as anyone, I would just like to say there's you're right. There is a method for my madness, and the point is that Brian O'Connor spoke highly of Mr. Weidner, and when he discussed the viability of this project and the uniqueness of the capital involved in the financing, and so clearly Mr. Weidner is very committed to wanting to do this. And I think as a council, we know we're going to have to cross these bridges. And so in order to get a jump start on a more productive and less agonizing development agreement, I think the more we can be clear with Mr. Weidner so he's not blindsided by something in the future. That was my intention here. It's to actually make it smoother in the next phase than even the parameter agreement. It may not necessarily be 100% appropriate for all of those to be there, but that my intention is to smooth out the process later on so there's fewer hard feelings or blindsidedness when we really do get more serious discussions on the development agreement.
All right. Unless there's anything new on the reports, comments, and initiatives from last night, if there's no further business to come before us.
Oh, Your Honor. Yes, I do have one thing. Sorry. Thanks for the reminder, Kelly. So at the retreat, you had the May retreat, you'd asked us to put together an expert panel for transit-oriented development. Does that ring a bell? Some of you maybe, some maybe not. So we've been in touch with some really good possible experts, and we're looking at Wednesday, October 10th, for a special meeting for a TOD panel to come and talk to the community. So you can look at that date, get back to me. You don't have to respond right now, but I just wanted to throw that date out there, October 10th, for a transit-oriented development panel, 7 o'clock.
With Sound Cities Association.
Okay. All right, that's all I have.
All right. If there's no further business to come in before us, we're adjourned.